You know, it's a real honor to be able to introduce and actually to reintroduce Miguel Altieri at an AERO event. And it's an absolute privilege for Timeless to be able to bring him to Montana for the AERO Expo. But something very important happened in 1984. And it was not the fact that Michael Jackson's hair caught on fire during a Pepsi commercial. That was in January. I mean, it's a great way to start the year. But in October of that year, AERO sponsored the 1984 Sustainable Ag Conference down at the land-grant University, MSU Bozeman, in the Strand Union Building. About 250 people came from around the region to listen to a whole host of great presentations. But that 84 conference, you know, was really a watershed event in many ways for AERO and for the sustainable ag movement here in Montana. How many people here were at that conference? Okay, some. Okay, that's great. How many people were actually were born in that year, 1984? Well, that's nobody. How about who was born after 1984? Okay, this is great. That's a great sign. So all you folks are forgiven for not being at the conference. Now everybody else, you missed something that was really very special. In many ways, that conference was the impetus for an energized and more focused organic movement in the state of Montana, both in the areas of policy and practice. This conference led to increased focus of AERO on sustainable ag issues. It led directly to the joint MSU-AERO Organic Advisory Committee, I think it was called, which began to examine and to challenge MSU's focus on industrial agriculture and high chemical inputs. That conference planted the seed for Montana's organic definition legislation, which was either the second or third in the nation. There was California, I think it was Maine, perhaps it was Oregon, but anyway, back in about '87, thanks to a lot of lobbying by Jim Bargrover actually, that legislation passed, and its roots traced back to that conference. It also, that conference also planted the seed for the creation of OCAM, the Organic Certification Association of Montana, the first kind of grassroots certifier here in the state. And as the interest in organic agriculture reached critical mass, AERO helped create the Montana Organic Association. And the Organic Association, in the last few years, has created the Organic Advisory and Educational Council, which collaborates very directly and very effectively with Montana State University, which is now doing some very impressive organic agriculture down at that institution. And of course, on a broader scale, we now have an amazing and quite robust organic industry in the state of Montana. So that conference was important. And it was also recognized nationwide. Beginning in the 1980s, early part of the 1980s, I don't know the exact year, but the Rodale Institute began publishing a magazine called The New Farm. And that was really the leading periodical in that time for examining, promoting organic agriculture and transition to organic agriculture. They were kind enough to publish the news release for our '84 conference, and the editor, George DeVault, said of that conference, he said, "It's probably the best slate of speakers I've ever seen." It was undoubtedly due to the fact that the opening speaker at that conference was Dr. Miguel Altieri from the College of Natural Resources Ag Experiment Station at the University of California in Berkeley. And it's probably not an exaggeration to say that Miguel Altieri had written the Bible of sustainable agriculture. It was called Agroecology, The Science of Sustainable Agriculture. I think the original edition was like 170 pages, something like that. This is more like 400 pages, second edition. It's still out there available, and I recommend reading it if you haven't. That book was really a game changer for sustainable agriculture across the U.S. and beyond, worldwide really. Miguel literally changed the conversation. He coined the term agroecology. The title of his presentation at the 84 conference was Developing a Sustainable Agriculture, the Biological, Economic, and Social Foundations. So just as that book kind of set the stage for a lot of things that were to come across the country and around the world, Miguel's address at that conference set the stage for the dialogue, the visioning that took place at that 84 conference, and set the stage for much of what has happened in Montana ever since. So I'm not going to give anything at all really about, about all the publications, the books and so forth that Miguel has written, all the important positions that he's had. That's all in the, or at least a bit of it is in the packet. So I want to tell a couple kind of more personal stories. The reason that Miguel came to Montana to that 84 conference was thanks to Nancy Matheson. In the early 80s, Nancy, Montana native, was at UC Berkeley. She was a technician at the experiment station down there, or the experiment farm, called the Gill Track. So I asked Nancy, I said, well, what's one of your memories about Miguel? And he said, well, in the early 80s, Miguel was fresh to the U.S., out of Chile. Nancy was a technician at the Gill Track farm. He says, I remember when Miguel came to that farm for the first time, he said, with heavy accent, but he looked at what we were doing and said, the Gill Track farm was doing monocrop test plots. One crop and all the test plots, variety trials and so forth. He said, Miguel came in and he kind of shook his head and said in so many words, this is not good agriculture. That we should be doing polyculture in these research plots. We should have diversity. We should be doing agroecology. So this is way back in the 80s, and as Nancy said, you can imagine how that went over at land-grant university. And the manager of the experiment station, I think she said his name was Philip, says he thought Miguel was crazy. Well, there are still people that think Miguel is crazy. Because most of the research around the country is still done in monocrop plots with a very narrow focus. But that is changing. Now companion cropping, polyculture, diversity over time and space, and a broader study and practice of agroecology is no longer crazy. We employ these practices in our gardens, we employ them on our farms, and we're starting to see them at universities, both in coursework and in research all across the country. And also among Miguel's students, admirers, and friends are Liz Carlisle, the author of The Lentil Underground, who got her PhD at Berkeley, but also her partner, Patrick Archie, who is the manager of the experimental farm on the campus of Stanford University. So I asked Patrick, I said, tell me a story about Miguel. Okay? And he said, well, his first year as professor at UC Berkeley in the early 80s, he and his colleague, Don Dahlstrom, from the Center for Biological Control, lost a pest control debate in California's Central Valley, sort of the belly of the beast for industrial agriculture. So Miguel and Don lost a debate in the Central Valley of California when their opponent drank a vial of pesticide to prove it was safe. Okay. So I don't know who that guy was. Miguel can tell us. He's verified that story is not apocryphal. You know, and I don't know if he's still alive. And if he's not alive, it may be because, you know, he died of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, of Parkinson's disease, or any of the other myriad of diseases that farmers across the planet have died from by using chemical inputs over the past decades. But Miguel is very much alive. He survived the debate. He survived another 4 decades, and he's here with us today. The other thing Patrick Archer told me is that in Brazil, Miguel is known as Papa de Agroecology, more or less. Excuse my Portuguese. Agroecology. Anyway, the Pope of Agroecology. So as I mentioned before, this is the second time that I have had the privilege of introducing Miguel. The first time was in the '84 conference, and at that point, you know, I sort of gave him the heads up during the introduction that, you know, back in the '80s, when Montanans thought of agriculture in California, kind of 2 things came to mind. One was terrible tomatoes, and the other was good marijuana. So now I have to tell you, I don't know the difference on the first 2, but at the very least, now also agroecology comes to mind when we think of agriculture, of Altieri, and California. So when you came to the AERO conference in 2018, you probably did not expect to be in the presence of the Pope. That's what Papa de Agroecology means. The Pope of Agroecology. So, I give you the Pope.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, welcome back.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, they call me El Padrino, not the Pope, the Godfather. But and I'm very glad to be back here 30-some years back, 34 years, something like that. And things have changed a lot in 34 years in the planet. I think for the worst, but agroecology sees the hope of, is the seed of hope. And that's what I want to transmit today, a positive message about what we can do, because the challenges are huge. So, and actually this person that drank, he ate actually DDT, a teaspoon, and then he offered us a teaspoon of ladybugs. He said, well, if biocontrol is so good, why don't you eat ladybugs? I don't know if you've eaten ladybugs, but they have cantharidin, a very nasty chemical. So we said no, and we had to get out of there because people started throwing tomatoes and papers and bottles, so we had to leave. And I had arrived in California 1 week, so that was my introduction to industrial agriculture in California. And I don't know if you can turn off this light so people can see better. But I'm very glad to be back here with a lot of friends, colleagues that I have interacted before, from Boseman, Bruce, and Fabian, and also the farmers here, and then which we had to all read because we were in in this committee. So agriculture is basically the simplification of nature, the artificialization of nature, where we take an ecosystem, a natural ecosystem that is full of biodiversity, that sponsors its own function. You don't need pesticides or fertilizers for the system to work, because the biodiversity plays there are so many interactions that sponsor processes like nutrient cycling, biocontrol, and so on. But as we start, reducing the diversity and simplifying, artificializing the ecosystems, and we make them into monocultures, then you can see that the dependence on external inputs starts increasing. And so we have been now to a level of simplification where 80% of the 1.5 billion hectares of agriculture in the world are monocultures that are highly simplified. They have a huge ecological toll, and they're very vulnerable. And there are some papers showing, for example, this paper in 2015, that there's a trend toward crop diversity loss and an homogenization of the landscapes in the United States in general. And this is happening also globally. And these trends could have far-reaching effects on ecosystem services that this natural vegetation that is being destroyed to promote the monocultures has. And for example, a paper by Landis in Michigan shows that in 4 US Midwest states, biofuel corn planting, which actually reduces homogenizes even more the landscapes, decreases the supply of natural enemies to soybean fields, reducing biological control services by 24%. So this loss of biocontrol, because we simplify the landscape, actually is costing producers $58 million per year. They have to use pesticides instead. And this genetic uniformity, actually in the 1970s, there was a report by the National Research Council saying that it's called crop vulnerability or crop uniformity, in which they were saying, most major crops in our country are impressively uniform genetically and therefore very vulnerable. And that was because of what happened with corn production here in the US because of the corn leaf epidemic that basically erased the production of about a decrease of 13 million tons in corn production because of the genetic homogeneity, the vulnerability, the disease took off. And because of that, then we have to spray a lot of pesticides. This is the trends globally. You can see even in Europe where they have a lot of regulations, environmental regulations, pesticide use is going up, Latin America and North America. But despite these warnings, homogenization continues with transgenic crops. There's 280 million hectares globally. The United States is number one. 65% of all the area of transgenic crops in the United States is soybean. And what the soybean does, here there's a transgenic field, condemns farmers to monoculture because you cannot grow anything. Forget about intercropping, forget about rotations, and condemns farmers to Roundup. And because of that continuous use, then the problem is that nature strikes back. So here we see weed resistance. All the green that you see are weeds that are resistant to Roundup. In South America, we have about 12 species that are already resistant to Roundup. In addition to all the other impacts that Roundup has on health, on the soil, microbes, and so on and so on. This industrial agriculture also produces about 29% to 45% of greenhouse emissions if you account for the transportation and the processing of the food. But just at the production level is 29%. This is interesting because these are the gases that are responsible for climate change, and this agriculture is kind of suicidal. It produces the greenhouse gases, but it's very susceptible to climate change. For example, in 2012, the worst drought in the Midwest of the US, actually in 50 years, actually came down, reduced the yields of corn and soybean, mostly transgenic, in about 30%. And this is the curve of corn production in the US. This is the pride of industrial agriculture. People say, look at how productive we have been increasing yields, yeah, at a tremendous cost, energy, environmental, social. But look at this point. This is 2012. That's exactly when the worst drought happened. There's a drop. That's the Achilles heel of industrial agriculture, climate change. So in California, we're still in drought, but by 2014, we had 400,000 acres left fallow and about 1.5 billion losses in production, without accounting how many farm workers had to be fired and leave the country because of lack of employment. So what is expected that the yield declines in industrial agriculture are going to be around 16% because of climate change, and that is going to lead to increases in food prices also, between about 150% probably. And then also we're not accounting for the externalities of industrial agriculture. In the UK, it is estimated that it's about 208 pounds per hectare if we accounted for water contamination, biodiversity loss, human health impacts, etc., soil losses, etc. This is not taken in consideration by the neoliberal economic models. These are externalities that we, society, pay at large. The other problem that is happening is that by the year 2050, more than 80% of the world population is going to live in cities. And the cities of more than 10 million people are going to triple around the globe. So we have to think about the global food system. For example, these people in Spain, you know, although they produce oranges in Spain, they have to import from California, and they travel 5,000 miles. And bananas from the West Indies and beef from Argentina and so on. This system is totally unsustainable in terms of the energy costs, the greenhouse emissions, and the fragility of a system like that. It is estimated, for example, that a city of 10 million people has to import 6,000 tons of food per day, which travels on average 1,000 miles. So, for example, in the Bay Area, which we're already 10 million, what happens if an earthquake comes and all the bridges fall down, the airport doesn't work, the highways don't work? As it happened in Japan, in Tokyo, with the last earthquake 2 years ago, food lasted 1 week in the supermarkets. And then after that, total chaos, okay? So that tells you the fragility of this globalized food system, and we have to start thinking about local food systems. So what is interesting that this industrial sector does not feed the world. It only produces 30% of the food that we eat globally, because they are mostly interested in producing biomass. But the little food that they produce, they use 70 to 80% of the arable land, 70% of the water, and 80% of the fossil fuels. It's a very inefficient way of producing food. And what we have as a challenge, you know, we need to increase sustainable production. It's not a necessary, it's a necessary condition, but not sufficient, because hunger is not due to lack of production. Why do we have 40 million people food insecure in the United States? It's not because there's no food. But using the same arable land with the less petroleum, less water and nitrogen, and with this in a scenario of climate change. So this challenge cannot be met with the existing industrial agriculture model and its biotechnological innovations. It's like what Einstein said, you cannot solve the problem with the same mentality that created it. We need a new paradigm. That paradigm is agroecology. And the features of the new agriculture is that it has to be decoupled from fossil fuel dependence, agroecosystems of low environmental impact, resilient to climate change, multifunctional, that play many roles, not only food production, but ecological services, social services, economic services, and it has to provide the foundation for local food systems. So what we're talking about is systems that are going to promote all these services, good health, vibrant local economies, and so on, social equity. And we need to come up with a new paradigm. Now, greening the green revolution will not work, because agroecology now, everybody's talking about it. 30 years, 40 years ago, my first book came out in 1982 in Spanish. Nobody was paying attention. Actually, we're combating us. They said, bunch of hippies, communists. Then they could not ignore the agroecological movement. So they started combating us, saying, oh, you cannot feed the world with agroecology. Agroecology is not productive. Agroecology is only for small farmers, poor farmers down there in the south and so on. Well, agroecology continued without support, obviously, but it continued. And today, they co-opt us. So FAO is talking about agroecology, World Bank, universities are talking about agroecology, but are talking about something totally different. They're inventing new terms like climate smart agriculture, sustainable intensification. So business as usual will not work. So for example, let's think about carbon farming. I know that a lot of people here are very much into sequestering carbon in the soil, which is important, but that's not the problem. The problem is that we need to start reducing how much we put in the air. You know, each of us in the United States produces 20 tons of CO2 per person per capita, whereas a person from Honduras, the people that are walking, they produce 0.1, okay? And we need to come to 12 tons per person. So we need to reduce our emissions dramatically, because historically, what's happening today with climate is the responsibility of a capitalist system sponsored by the US and Europe historically, and then China later, 20 years ago only. So there's an ecological debt in order to solve the problem from the north to the south. So what is carbon trading? It's a source of windfall profits for polluting sectors. For example, in California, heavy polluting corporations are the ones that are getting the carbon credits. Because if a large CAFO owner, if you put a biodigester, you're already green. And then you get paid for carbon credits. But you keep having these huge operations, that have all other kinds of social and ecological and environmental impacts. So carbon farming is basically to fine-tune and mitigate the destructive potential aspects of industrial food production, and our old strategies at easing the sustainability crisis, like painting in green a little bit, but let's continue with the same model, but we're just going to paint a little bit of green. So for example, biochar. Yeah, you can put biochar if you can get it and pay for it. And then after that, you grow a monoculture like this. This is a biochar monoculture, but yeah, you're sequestering carbon, but all the other problems continue. Pests, use chemicals to control pests, and so on and so on. Now, is organic farming the alternative? For example, more than 35 million hectares are certified, but 80% of them are under input substitution. In developing countries, more than 75% of the organic food is exported, so the local people don't eat it. And in the United States, due to higher costs, it's just the food for rich. Just like fair trade and slow food, who goes to those restaurants? I send my students to the farmer's market in Berkeley. You'll never see an Afro-American person and a Latino buying in those markets. So it's because of the food difference, the price of food. Although this is locally produced by small farmers, but it's because of the economics of scale. The capitalist system works that way. And this is input substitution. This is a farmer, organic farmer, pioneer in California, orders the compost from an industry, from a company, by internet, grows the monoculture of strawberry. You cannot say whether this is organic or conventional if you're walking by. And then employs all these farm workers, which are Mexican farmers that were displaced by the free trade agreement because the United States dumps the corn production in Mexico at a lower price than these poor farmers can produce it. So they're expelled from their land by free trade. And then we wonder, why are we having all these people? Why are those people marching? 4,000 people. Yeah, we supported those dictatorships down there in Honduras. That's why those people are leaving. And so these people, what they're doing, they're releasing, these are organic, they're releasing spider mites that are predaceous against pests but they have to do it weekly because it's input substitution. They don't create the habitat for beneficial insects to remain in the environment and so on. And there are farmers that are applying 18 different products. Their cost of production are huge, and there are contradictions. For example, in grapes, you spray sulfur, and at the same time you want to encourage biological control. It turns out that the sulfur kills all the wasps that you release for biological control. So you start getting into these treadmills. Number of farms, and these are the ones, how much of the trade they control. And you can see that 3% of the largest organic farmers in California control 80% of the business. 3 farmers. This is concentration, corporatization of organic farming. That's what's going on, at least in California. Productivity, high efficiency. And that comes about by creating systems that are low external input, highly diversified with high recycling rates, and a high level of integration between crops, trees, animals, and so on. Where are those systems? Small farmers in the developing world that have been farming, for example, in the Andes for 5,000 years. Generation after generation, they have stood the test of time. So if we want to talk about resiliency and sustainability, let's go and see some of these farmers that have been doing this for 5,000 years. For example, not only in Latin America, if you go to Asia, you find these rice systems. And in these rice systems, you're going to find that they grow different varieties of rice. In the off-season, they have rotations with different crops. They have trees. They have animals inside. One of these is fish. These fish are an important source of protein, but they also play an ecological function that is very important. When they move, when they swim, they move the nutrients. They also control weeds, and they push the rice so that these leafhoppers fall, and then they eat them. Then they started sponsoring Zola, which is a fern and an algae symbiosis that fixes 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, which 40% goes to the rice. But before this starts suffocating the oxygen and killing the fish, they bring ducks. So the ducks eat the azolla, and they eat also other components. And at the end, you end up with a very integrated system where you have a complex set of interactions in which, by just sponsoring the right kind of functional biodiversity, the system works. So that's what agroecology is. It's kind of ecological engineering, where you just put together different components through their interactions, the sponsor, the biological control, the nutrient cycling, the weed control, and so on and so on. So we have a lot to learn from these peasants. You know, there's 1.5 billion farming 2-hectare plots on average, but they produce 50 to 75% of the food in 20% of the land, 25 to 30% of the land, 30% of the water, and 20% of the fossil fuels. So these peasants, these small farmers throughout the world that are producing up to 70% of the food are doing it in a very efficient way on small plots with almost no inputs. And why that does? Why does that happen? Well, as David was saying, polycultures. They have very complex systems where there's above ground, below ground interactions that I don't have time to go through. And because of these ecological interactions that happen, the systems overyield. So for example, let's say you have a corn and bean monoculture versus a polyculture. You can see that if you just look at the yield of the corn in monoculture versus the corn in monoculture, in polyculture, you would say, well, the monoculture is more productive. But what you have to do is to analyze the efficiency of the resource use, which is called through the land equivalent ratio, where you have to divide monoculture versus polyculture of the two crops. And if it gives you a value higher than 1.5, for example, there, means that you need 1.5 hectares of monoculture to get what you get from 1 hectare of polyculture, because you're overlapping two systems using nutrients, water, solar energy, everything more efficiency. So agroecology then is a science that integrates what we learn in our universities, you know, ecology, social sciences, very basic agricultural sciences, soil, plant pathology, etc., with the knowledge of farmers, and create a dialogue of wisdoms from which principles emerge. So when I talk about traditional farmers' knowledge, sometimes it could be a knowledge that for us is kind of shocking. For example, if you go to the Andes at 3,000 meters and you ask a farmer, how good is the soil? The farmer goes, that's pretty good soil. And then you're a PhD from Davis and you go like, what? Well, there are different classification systems. Peasants have, indigenous people have classification systems of nature that are very different. So we need to open our dialogue, our language to understand this. So agroecology is a set of principles, it's not practices. Those principles take technological forms, take the forms of practices, but depending on the different socioeconomic and environmental and cultural conditions. So polycultures, well, what kind of polycultures? Agroforestry, and what kind of agroforestry system? Those depends, are very site-specific. So there are some principles of agroecology that I don't have time to go through. And these principles take the form of practices. And there's many, many reports that have come out. IPES, the final report of IISTD, FAO, and so on, are coming out and saying, yeah, agroecology is the way to go. So if agroecology is so good, why is it that it's not being spread? You know, why is it not adopted by more farmers, thousands of farmers? Well, there are many barriers. Some of them is lack of enabling policy environment, lack of right incentives, absence of special markets, lack of very little funding. For example, in California, 1% of the land-grant university budget of the University of California goes to organic farming, not even to agroecology, 1%. And then low numbers of trained professionals and farmers on this. Those are kind of some barriers. The real barrier is the real lock-in preventing a transition to agroecology is the control of the food system, seeds, technology, information, and outlets. By whom? By big corporations, which are also penetrating the land-grant universities. Berkeley has a grant from BP, $500 million. They bought the place, to promote transgenic biofuels. They betrayed the land-grant mission. So there's a huge market concentration. 3 companies control 60% of the seeds. You know that Bayer bought Monsanto. 7 companies control the majority of fertilizers, and so on and so on. This is the real barrier that we need to somehow transcend. Because these food empires, which are the corporations that determine what the farmers produce, how much they're going to produce, do you think farmers have a choice? They don't have a choice. The Farm Bill, who influences the Farm Bill? So they determine what the farmers produce, how much they're going to produce, what technology they're going to use, and also these guys, which are the Walmarts and all these guys, determine what the people are going to eat. How much they're going to eat, how much they're going to pay, the quality of the food. So they have strangled the food system. So the goals of agroecology is a transformative science. This is where the political element comes in that makes a lot of people in the land-grant system very uncomfortable. No, agroecology is only science. No, but it's a science that has a social function and a political mission to radically transform the way we produce and consume food, while contributing to local economic well-being, social justice, and the creation of equitable and healthy food systems. And what we need to do is scale up agroecology. More farmers and larger territories using agroecology. So how do we have done that in Latin America? And I wanted to bring some examples from there. One is sizing opportunities from crisis. One example that we always bring up is Cuba, where, as you know, when the Soviet bloc collapsed and the Soviet bloc was sponsoring basically the agriculture of Cuba, there was a reduction in the imports of pesticides and fertilizers and petroleum in about 50 to 70%. Can you imagine tomorrow we turn off in Montana the entrance of petroleum and fertilizers and pesticides? What would happen? So what happened in Cuba is that large-scale agriculture, the state farms, collapsed. These are the contribution, these are different crops, the contribution of small farmers before the crisis, when there was pesticides. This is the contribution after the crisis. The small farmers which were farming agroecologically, using different practices, were the ones that started feeding the people. So you can see that they use all the agroecological strategies. And this farmer, for example, Casimiro, because in Cuba there is a land reform law. If you want land, they give you 13 hectares. That's 26 acres of land for life. So at the beginning, he was conventional. He was growing corn and tobacco. He went through agroecological training. He converted his farm into this very interesting system with a lot of hedgerows that are multifunctional, rotations, silvopastoral systems, agroforestry systems, polycultures, etc. And this system actually, as you can see at the beginning, this is the external inputs that they were using. It went to zero almost. Because as the ecological infrastructure was settled, established, then the ecological interactions started making the system function. And if you look at how much people they can feed, for example, with protein, they can feed 34 persons with a production of 1 hectare of protein. So 340 people, because they have 10 hectares, with an energy efficiency of 30. That means they put 1 kilocalorie, they get 30 back. There's no more efficient agriculture than that in the world. And then what happened in Cuba also is that because there was no petroleum to bring the food from the rural areas into the cities, urban agriculture started emerging. And there's tremendous data on this about 2000, just right after the Soviet bloc collapse, almost 2,500 hectares in Havana alone were producing 25,000 tons of food per year. And 50% of the fresh produce of the island is already now in 56,000 hectares of urban agriculture. That's about 120,000 or more acres. And these systems, which are called organopónicos, their average yield is about 18 kilos per square meter. So in 1 square meter, I'm going to produce between 18 and 20 kilos of food, edible food. Okay, if we brought this to Oakland, where we have in Berkeley, you know, the Oakland city in the Bay Area, where the worst food deserts among the low-income populations, let's say that we brought this technology to Oakland, where there is 1,400 acres of abandoned public land. Abandoned public land. Well, we could be feeding 800,000 people. But where's the political will? People have no access, no training. So urban agriculture is suffering also from lack of support. We could do it with agroecological principles. So we've been starting to do that in California. Now there's a plus that we have where we train farmers using many of the methods used in Cuba to polycultures and rotations and so on. The other one is moralizing farmers' innovation. Farmers are always innovating. For example, in Costa Rica, people say that you cannot grow tomatoes because there's a whitefly. Well, this farmer was growing tomatoes, but you say, well, where's the tomato? Well, the tomato is hidden in between cilantro, because the cilantro repels the whitefly, so you can see the populations go way down. Or farmers in southern Brazil, they use the mixture of cover crops using veg and rye and other crops. Then they use the roll of faca, the roller. Then that roller basically kind of rolls the crop, doesn't incorporate it, doesn't cut it, and so on. Then on that, they grow the crops, the beans and the corn, and you can see that there's no weeds emerging here. The reason is not because they're using herbicides. What happens is that as the residues start decomposing, they create a toxic zone of allelopathic compounds, like, for example, butyric acid and other things. Any seed that is here, and 90% of the wheat seed bank is here. We have some very good weed ecologists here that could correct me. Will die. If you plant your crop, will die also. It will not germinate. But farmers then learn how to put it deeper in the soil. So the corn and the beans germinate without that. Now, this idea was stolen by farmers here in the US. They didn't compensate the farmers in the South for their innovation. There's biopiracy in agroecology too. So this farmer now, they're developing this roll of facas, the rollers, you know, with rye, and you can see now that they can produce organic monocultures without herbicides, thanks to the innovation of farmers in Brazil. Another way is building resilience. We have done some research. Clara is going to give a workshop this afternoon. We have a network in Latin America called Redagres, and we have done many, many studies in areas where there has been an extreme climatic event. We go there, and there's 3,000 farmers, but among those 3,000, maybe there's 300 that resisted. So we're interested in knowing why. What are the features of those farms that make them resilient? We have seen that vegetation diversity, landscape matrix, and soil and water management are key components of resiliency if you want to design farms that way. So for example, in Central America, when Hurricane Mitch happened in the 1990s, Eric Hol Jimenez, who is the director of Food First, did a very interesting study where he compared monoculture farms with polyculture farms, and actually the polyculture farms resisted more the impact. There were less landslides, as you can see, because of the cover of the soil, the agroforestry systems, and so on. Studies that were done later in Cuba with Hurricane Ike also showed the same impact. Because of the agroforestry system, the windbreaks were able to slow down the speed of the. So these trees fall down, but then they can be actually put back. I went to Puerto Rico, and what happens when you don't have windbreaks, these trees go 20 meters away with roots and everything. So, and there's areas in industrial farming suffer more damage. Typical story. More diversified farm, more resilient, more resistant. They're able to resist the impact, and they're also able to recover from the impact more quickly. The same thing happens with pastures. I know that you guys have a lot of pastures here. In these systems here, when there's a drought, these grasses that were introduced, for example, in Colombia, from Africa, very highly productive grasses. But if you have fertilizers and water, when the drought comes, this is what happens. Thousands of hectares dry, animals die, except in these silvopastoral systems, where you have grasses, lucina, a shrub, a leguminous shrub, and trees that are providing shade. Because what happens here is that the annual evapotranspiration goes down. The temperature here is 2 to 3 degrees centigrade higher. The relative humidity is about 30% higher here in this system. So you create a microclimate which makes these systems much more resilient. And you can see that regardless of the rainfall pattern, milk production remains constant at 10 liters per hectare, 10 liters per cow per day. So this is true resiliency. It doesn't matter. You have a drought, I continue more or less the same. If you have too much water, continues the same. And these systems can be industrialized. I mean, there are silvopastoral systems where you have different trees that are wood-producing trees with cattle, rotational grazing going on around, or sheep going on in fruit trees, and so on and so on. So they can be adapted, the same principles, to a much more modern type of setting. The other approach is creating agroecological lighthouses. Lighthouses, we call them lighthouses because they irradiate lessons of how to design successful farms. So in Chile, back in the 80s, we created a small farm of half hectare, which is 1 acre. And the idea was that this farm, managed by a family of 5, would feed that family and have an excess of production. So there's a complex rotation that is described in that book. And here's the map. And then what we found is that after 3 years of conversion, the rotation was producing 3.16 tons of food. The home garden that was around the house was producing 1 ton. Fruits, the fruits that were surrounding the farm, about 1 ton, and so on and so on. Eggs, 2,500. One family of 5 cannot eat all that. There's a surplus. So when there's a surplus that can be sold, that the family makes money, but also they save $400 a month in food and in inputs, 0 inputs into the system. So one way of making money is not just selling your food, but also saving in how much you buy of food and the inputs that come in. Now, how does all this stuff gets mobilized and spread throughout Latin America? It's through a movement called Campesino. There was a very important educator in Latin America called Paulo Freire, who wrote a book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which actually set the tone for popular education in many, many fields. And one of them was this. It's a horizontal way of spreading knowledge between farmers. And for example, one example is that one farmer comes from one community and teaches other farmers in that community, women and men, about certain technique. For example, they start always with soil conservation. And then each one of these becomes a promotor, which trains another 10. And that's how it spreads. This kind of system puts out of business the extension service of the United States. I'm sorry. So, for example, one example is the velvet bean in Central America, which is a legume that is used in the hillsides to cover the soil. And then they use it as a cover crop. They incorporate it, increase the yields, etc., etc. That's how it spreads. Thousands of farmers, 45,000, 50,000 farmers. And the last strategy is the strategy of creating agroecological territories, where now farmers are not just in one territory, you have just one farm totally surrounded by transgenic crops, but the control of the territory. And that control can be through occupation, like the MST, which is the Landless Peasant movement in Brazil that occupies about 1 million hectares of land, or by electing mayors that are agroecologically motivated and support this, and many other strategies. So for example, this is in Mixteca Alta in Mexico. This is the result of what happens after deforestation or grazing. But here you can see that there's some green land because these farmers decided, indigenous people decided to stay there. What are they going to do if they leave this area? They're going to go to US and work, or? No. So they started a whole process of recovery, restoration of the landscape, ecological restoration. soil conservation practices, water harvesting, et cetera, which actually allowed that in a period of 5 years, more than 1 million trees were planted and more than 1,000 farmers were trained to restore 500 hectares. So now they can stay in their territory and produce food. Or in Colombia, in Dobio, in a valley, in a watershed, here is this community. At the beginning, they had enough water for 25 people. They started the restoration of the watershed by the community itself. And then here you can see now that they have totally restored the landscape, the watershed, which actually now produces water for 75 families. And there's diversification, there's food security, there's community cohesion, many other results that came out of this. So what happens with agroecology in Latin America that started with NGOs, universities, but then now is in the hands of the social movements. But it's a much more militant agroecology. So they say agroecology has been taken by rural social movements as a transformative science and movement explicitly committed to a more just and sustainable future by reshaping the relations from farm to table. And these are the declarations. If you go to the Via Campesina website, which is the largest peasant movement in the world, actually in the US there is a Via Campesina component, they say we see agroecology as a key form of resistance to an economic system that puts profit before life. Agroecology within a food sovereignty framework offers us a collective path towards a new reality out of the crisis. And they talk about the food sovereignty instead of food security. Because food security is, yeah, Montana imports what, 80% of the food? 70, I don't know. It's not sovereign. It's secure because you have the money to bring the food and buy it. This is the control of the means of production, food sovereignty. So you have to have, first protect against dumping. We will not import anything into our state that farmers produce here. Second, social movements that are going to be pushing the government, agroecological strategies, land reform, access to land. If you look at the report of the Young Farmers Association of America, the first problem that the few young people that want to farm is land access. So you have to have access to land, seeds, water, and then you have to have the support of the state to promote agroecology. Because when they say, well, we're going to promote agricultural education, what kind of education are we talking about? We're talking about agroecological credit, agroecological extension, agroecological research. Because this movement became so strong, they created laws in certain countries, like Brazil, for example, which who knows what's going to happen tomorrow in Brazil. But right now, there's a law, national law of agroecology. Why? Because social movements pushed to create that. So one aspect of that law is what is called the school lunch program, where, for example, the government buys 30% of all the produce of the small farmers of the region to serve the lunches in the schools. 2,000 municipalities, 45 million students daily that you have to feed with this food produced by small farmers. So this takes farmers out of the competition by securing them an income. 30% of the production, which is organic, is going to go to feed the people in the schools. So we need to transform the food system with alternative food networks, but actually that democratize the food system. So what we're talking about, remember the food empires? They control what the farmers produce, the consumers. We have to fight this, but this is going to take a lot of energy. Better create a bypass. A bypass where we create autonomous territories with more democratized markets. That means more solidarity markets. That means that it's not totally ruled by the capitalist laws of market. There's more solidarity components. Now, just to finish here, agroecology is not just only for small farmers. The principle of agroecology can also be applied at a large scale by making this transition to a more sustainable system. So we're talking about going from the monocultures to a farming redesign, but that is more in accordance with the large-scale logic. You have to use mechanization and so on. So we go from the input substitution to the sustainable agriculture redesign of the farm based on agroecological principles. The first step usually is the economic threshold, the IPM, which is intelligent pesticide management. Then we go beyond input substitution. We went through this one already. And then what we do is use the principles of agroecology to adopt the agroecological diversification strategies that break the monoculture and bring the functional biodiversity. So for example, this is in Salinas Valley. This is organic. 12 different products being used, especially for controlling aphids. But if you put, for example, alyssum strips every 100 meters, then this hosts hoverflies, which actually control up to a certain distance the pest. So you have to redesign the farm so that you break that gradient, so that there's enough hoverflies that go from here to here and from here to here and so on and so on. And that way you cut the use of all these organic pesticides, which actually many of them kill beneficial insects. Or in vineyards, Clara did all her dissertation on these systems, converting. These are monoculture organic in the summer, but you can diversify them. For example, by using buckwheat, by using Lobularia maritima under the drip irrigation. So here you can see a system in function. And then here, since the buckwheat dies, there's no irrigation in the early spring, early summer, then you plant in the middle wild carrot or ami, which has a very deep taproot and is the only source of flowers for beneficial insects to be present in the system. But then we can work at the landscape level. For example, this forest here, the riparian forest in the northern California, are an incredible source of beneficial insects. So why don't design a corridor in which these insects can move into the system and colonize the farm? Or where you don't have that, you can create an island in the middle of the farm. This is in Benziger. And this island actually is a source of beneficial insects that colonize the vineyard, and therefore they don't use any of this pyganic and all these chemicals that are organic in the farm. Why can't we go back to these systems? You know, I went to the yearbook, I don't know if it's 1940 something, in Michigan. They used to grow lettuce with seedlings of barley. This is after, you know that after the Dust Bowl, Bennett, who was the leader of soil conservation, created the systems for wind erosion control. Look at this one, cotton with barley. I mean, if you do rotations here, you would control weeds. I don't think they did the research on the ecological interactions, but these systems existed, they were mechanized. So can we go back to these systems? Well, there are some interesting attempts. I have a good friend, unfortunately he died. I don't know if you ever heard of Doug Tompkins. He was the owner of Esprit, North Face, and he bought a lot of land in the south of Chile and Argentina, and he donated it back to the government to create parks, but also he was very much into agroecology. So this farm in Corrientes, Argentina, this is the legacy of soybean monoculture, transgenic. Erosion, contamination, deforestation. He transformed that into this. And Clara and I helped him in the design, restoring these corridors. Here he would have cover crops, and here he would have fruit trees with pastures. So here there would be the cover crops. After the cover crops comes the crops. Here there would be pastures. So we would use the systems that used to be used very much in the Midwest back in the 50s. Strip intercropping is all mechanized. There's a lot of research showing that these intercropping systems worked very well. For example, I have some data from 1985 showing that the returns per acre were more than $42, $50, $161 because of the interactions that were going in those systems. And then, these are the cover crops. This is where the strip intercropping goes. Then he would put fruit trees of 13 different species with pastures in between, with rotational grazing of sheep going on here with electric fences. So that farm, unfortunately, when he died, the wife sold it. But it was a very interesting example of what you can do at a large scale with agroecological principles. This is another example from Colombia. This is sugarcane in the Cauca Valley near Cali. This is what's happening with the production of sugarcane, the returns on fertilizer. So this is yield per kilogram of nitrogen used. So it's going down. This is what's happening. It's, the second law of the diminishing returns that, what was his name? Liebig was talking about. So the more input you put, the less efficient your system is. So these farmers, this is a farm of 300 hectares in the middle of that sea of conventional agriculture. What they do is they grow cowpea, which is a green manure, in between the sugarcane, because it turns out that the sugarcane takes 12 months. So during the first 5 months, you can have crops in between as a green manure. Then, as the crop grows, you bring the sheep that goes inside to weed and also fertilize. So what's happening in this farm is that you can see that, again, regardless of what happens with the weather, the production remains about the same. All the other farms, when there's a drought, it goes down. And what we're finding is that the cost of production starts going down and the profit goes up. Because here they're saving, their profit is not because they're selling it more expensive, it's because they're saving in inputs. The ecological services of the farm are at work. So basically what agroecology does, decreases the cost of production, your revenue stays maybe the same, but your costs go down. So that's what makes the difference in agroecological farms that are designed that way. And what were the outcomes of the conversion? Well, 4% organic matter, very similar to the forest nearby. 1.5 liters of water per square meter stored in the soil with every 1% of organic matter that was increased. And then that led to 50 to 60% less irrigation in the system, with 1.5 damage by the Diatrea. All the other farms have 10 to 15% damage by a pest. This one has only 1.5. Why? It has a lot of spiders and ants that are predaceous inside the system. So, just to finish here, we have two ways. Peasant agriculture is very important for food sovereignty. We need to keep supporting it. But also we can reconvert our agricultural system, the industrial systems, conventional and organic, to agroecology. So agroecology then is the marriage between two knowledges. The principles take the form of practices. The practices foment processes. And the processes then we can measure whether they're working or not with indicators that farmers can use. For example, a practice, a principle, recycling organic matter. Practice, cover crop. Process, soil conservation, water conservation, organic matter accumulation, etc. Okay, we want to see if that process is working. What kind of easy indicators can farmers do to know whether the processes are really working or not? And we also need to move beyond what we actually measure now. Instead of measuring net calorie production, nutrient content per hectare, local calorie and nutrient availability, total outputs versus per hectare, and so on and so on. We need to change the metrics. And think of this process. We're probably maybe here, but we need to move to agroecology. So the way to do that is that we need to have supporting farmer-to-farmer networks, funding research and education, provision of enabling policies, strategic alliances, empowering women, research, and so on and so on. Consumer solidarity is very important, because when we eat, there's an ecological act and a political act. And then also we need to understand what have been the drivers of massification of agroecology in other countries. For example, the existence of a crisis. We're in a crisis here, but it's masked. We're not realizing that we're in a crisis. But in countries where it hits, that's very important. Social organization, political organization, that's the social milieu in which agroecology spreads. You have to have that. If you don't have that, it doesn't work. Obviously, through networks that share the knowledge. Mobilizing discourses, very important. There's always a woman or a man that are leaders present. External allies, markets, policy. All this is important, but the most important thing I would say is social organization and networks, so that we can spread agroecological knowledge. And that would be the seeds of hope that I wanted to bring. Thank you. I don't know if we have time for question or, yes?
I grew up on a small organic farm with a mom who said you got to put everything back that you take off. In our world today, where we're talking of constantly trying to get more out of a resource, where do you level land ethics, ethics in general, to profits and a real incentive? In other words, an incentive is food, but an incentive is money. How do you divide that?
Well, I don't think we can put all the responsibility, as I was saying, on the producers. We, the consumers, have a major role to play in changing the food system. And that ethics has to come from that convergence of solidarity. That's why we talk about the bypass, that is not, there is exchange of money, but it's not totally ruled by the laws of the market that prevail today. For example, in Colombia, we know communities of farmers in poor towns that they sell their produce with the same price as 10 years ago. 10 years ago. They go to the market and in 2 hours, at 6 o'clock in the morning, it's gone. Everything is gone. Because these are poor people that are buying the food from them. So we need to find ways of democratizing the food system. And I think that talking about the Pope, it's interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with the Laudato Si. But Laudato Si is the encyclical of the Pope on ecology, which has brings a lot of these things that you're talking about, the ethics. What is the new ethics that we're going to use? So the new ethics for agroecology is the right to food, which is a human right that cannot be governed by trade. So it has to be realized by democratizing the food system and making the food available for the poor and vulnerable people, which we have a lot of people here in California, in the US. In California, we have 125,000 homeless people. Okay, they have no access to food and so on. So how are we going to make food available to those poor people that have suffered the consequence of an unjust economic system? And the second one is that we need to challenge the way we see private property, because there is a thing called the social function of the land. The social function of the land means that the land that is agriculture, arable land, has to be under production of food. So the social function has to be implemented in order for that to happen. But we need to challenge the way we see private property today. Well, that's a big, big, big challenge in a society of the United States. So that's why we need to create a new agriculture, but that is underlined by these new ethics. The right to food, the social function of the land, the democratization of the food system, all that requires political change. This is not going to happen just because some farmers are practicing this kind of things. But it can happen at the local level. That's what's important. Regardless of what's happening at the international, global level, we can create these spaces of hope that are going to create these lighthouses that perhaps are going to illuminate other experiences that start reproducing all over the place.
About 40 years ago, the World Mariculture Society basically was stating that they had solved the problem for providing protein to people, and yet you didn't even mention anything about mariculture or aquaculture as a protein source.
Yeah.
Because the industry has failed you.
Whether I didn't talk about mariculture or aquaculture. Well, first of all, I didn't talk about that because I'm not involved in that field, but it's very important to understand that agriculture is impacting the oceans, through the dead zones and all that. But our fish are also very poisoned. And then that's a problem. Microplastics and also lead and other things and mercury and so on. So, and then fish, the fisheries are declining dramatically. So in many parts where it's possible, aquaculture is used in systems. For example, I used the example of the rice. You can also have ponds. Many farmers have ponds where they're raising their own fish and so on. I don't know much about what goes on in the ocean. I know that there's a huge extraction of fish, and there's the problems of pollution and so on. But aquaculture, where it's possible and practical, it is being promoted. And there are many models in China and other places of integrated agriculture, aquaculture systems that we can learn from.
If your system was able to be instituted around the world, how many more people would be involved with growing food and how much more time?
Well, that's an important question because I teach agroecology, Clara teaches sustainable rural development, I teach urban agriculture, and when I ask my students, how many of you are going to be farmers? None of them. And the average age of farmers is about, 55, 60 years old in this country, and in many countries. There's also migration of young people to the cities and so on. So how are we going to revert that? It's not just by giving them land. So what's happening is that Via Campesina, for example, has created universities called the YALAs, Latin American Institutes of Agroecology. Why? Because the universities were not giving them the response. If they send the sons and daughters of farmers to the university, what do they learn? Green Revolution. Well, that's not useful. We want to teach them agroecology. So they created their own universities. But it's not only technical formation. Why these young people now want to go back to their land is because they understand the political reasons why the parents were poor, landless, and so on. So there has to be a political education also so that these young people understand that the reason their parents are poor, the reason that they're expelled from their land, has very deep political ecology, political economic reasons. And we need to understand that. So those young people now become empowered. They know what's going on politically, and they also know they have the skills. And they go back to their communities, and they're creating. So I couldn't answer how many people, but we have to have people that want to go back, educated. We have to do integrated rural development so that in the rural areas there are also other things that young people want, education, opportunities, and so on and so on. And in addition to that, access to land. I mean, how many people can go, even if they want to farm, young people, how many of them can afford the land? So that's an issue. Land reform is fundamental in order to realize the right to food and agroecology. Thank you.